Welcome to City Cinematheque, where the art and pleasure of the movies are the subject of serious discussion. I'm your host, Jerry Carlson, and I teach film studies at the City College of the City University of New York. Today, we continue our series, Masters of Film Noir, and we have one of the big ones, Scarlet Street, directed by Fritz Lang. This is a film with a classic femme fatale, and it's a film that was banned in New York City at the time of its attempted initial release. There's much to be said about this film as film noir, as an example of extraordinary film technique, and as a document of post-war United States. We'll be talking about that and other things with today's guest. It's a pleasure to have back on City Cinematheque Professor Thomas Levine from Princeton University, a noted expert on contemporary film, media theory, and film of German and Central European origin. Now, enjoy Scarlet Street. Welcome back to City Cinematheque. I hope you've enjoyed the pleasure of seeing Scarlet Street, considered by almost all film historians as a major film noir and a major work of Fritz Lang in his American period. There's a lot to talk about this film. Much has been said about it, and I hope we're going to say some things today that are a little bit different from what has been said before. In that journey, joining us today, once again on City Cinematheque, is our good friend Tom Levine, professor of German and Media Studies at Princeton University, who has been thinking and writing about media in the 20th century, including the material, the technologies themselves, as well as having taught Fritz Lang on more occasions perhaps than you can count at this particular point, Tom?
That's probably true, yes.
Yeah, probably true. So this is a film that was actually played with the production code quite distinctively and was initially banned in 3 cities, including New York City, Milwaukee, and Atlanta. So let me put it as technically as possible. What's up with that?
I think it's always incredibly interesting when a film strikes a nerve such that censorship intervenes. And it wasn't banned in all cities, but it was certainly banned in New York, in Atlanta, in Milwaukee. And I think it may well have to do with the fact that, as I imagine we will discuss at some point, the film is very open at the end. And indeed, there's what I would call a kind of undecidability that is threatening, because unlike other films, it doesn't give us a very clear moral compass.
Absolutely.
Figures that we think are morally upstanding, correct, innocent, naive, charming, the good guys, turn out to be more complicated. People who seem to be more scurrilous, the Johnnies, the kiddies, instrumental, slightly grifters, basically, turn out to be themselves victims, innocently condemned to death on the electric chair. So where do we stand with regard to these people? And the fact that there's no clear answer to that is threatening.
Yeah, absolutely. And let's just point out that since 1934, the Hays Code had been in, and if people have not seen it, you can really go and look at the book of rules about what constitutes morality in American films. And it's really quite prescriptive. And indeed, that became the game, in a certain sense, for the next 30 years, is how can you find the expressive cinematic means to create story experiences that, are not captured by that absolutist version of morality that was written into the code, in which there must be perfect clarity about who is good, who is bad, who is punished, who can survive or not.
And there's a further point to be made, I think. Let's remember, this film was released in 1945.
Correct.
So moral clarity is a global geopolitical imperative, particularly when we have a German director.
Absolutely.
I think one could make the case, I would make the case, that this film could be read as instantiating a kind of moral relativism that a few years later, in 1948, Hannah Arendt would describe as the banality of evil.
Right.
That if even a naive, harmless, milquetoast painter sweetheart like Chris Cross can become an perhaps involuntary murderer, crime of passion, et cetera, this is says something about the possibility of gross violations of ethical standards and their potential for everyone to be victim to.
Well, just to underline your point, at the end of the film, when he's the bum on in Central Park, and the policemen come up to him, the guy says him, they roust him, and then one cop says to the other, "Who is this guy?" "Oh, he's a guy who's always here. He has some crazy thing about he killed people, etc."
And wants to be punished for it.
And wants to be punished for it, right, etc. But because he fits into the category of the innocent bum who should just be replaced, down in the Bowery,
where
no
he
one
belongs.
Right, absolutely.
Right.
No one can believe that this person was capable of that. This has to be, the evil that he has committed has to be a delusion on his part, not actual evil that he has committed. Because it's the banality of evil that you mentioned, the famous Hannah Arendt idea, is unimaginable to the cops.
And in the context of a war that is just over, the imperative that we know what is good, and that's us, and we know what is bad, and that's them, is so urgent. And I can imagine why this was threatening. I think there's also something about the deeply uncanny sonic dimension of the film. And I think how to respond to the film's complexity involves understanding how it works with a dynamic of the visual on the one hand versus the acoustic.
Lang is the person who is frequently taught and given the full credit he should be for a film like M, which is seen as one of the great innovative early sound films, a landmark in this. And there is a tendency to perhaps neglect his innovative uses of sound in the later films. And so there's been much more discussion directly of the visual of Scarlet Street without this relationship between the visual and the oral that you're about to talk about. So I just wanted to frame that and contextualize it. So hit it, Matt.
Well, in fact, the film seduces us into that misunderstanding of the centrality of the visual, because thematically it's all about paintings. It's all about what do we see? How do we look at this painting? What is a painting? What is a good painting? How is a painting different from other kinds of creative activities, like the things drawn on the wall in the illustrator's studio that Kitty rents? And by the way, it's not accidental, we'll get to the acoustic in a moment, that the comment she makes about when she moves into that apartment, well, one thing she wants to change is the wallpaper. Wallpaper is a really interesting category because it's a category which that central theorist of aesthetic theory, Immanuel Kant, he talks about wallpaper. Why? What's wallpaper? He says wallpaper is a kind of decoration that is instrumental. It serves a kind of purpose, whereas the aesthetic is purposivity without a purpose. Art doesn't serve any purpose. That's what makes it art. Yeah. It can't be instrumentalized. The film opens, the first thing we see, the first scene is Chris's boss getting out of the car and going up to the party in which he's being feted, in which Chris will receive the fancy gold watch. But we hear a sound. And what is that sound? It's an organ grinder.
Indeed it is.
And so this is 19th century urban audio for purposes of surplus value. making a living. This is not purposivity without a purpose. This is making money.
You bet.
This is instrumental audio. Then he goes into the party. We see another technology of the acoustic, a piano. But here too, it is functioning as, producing a kind of sonic landscape for their merriment. It's only when later in the film we start exploring one category after another of different audio technologies. First, most thematized, radio.
Yeah, absolutely.
The happy household hour, which we hear from below, and which, let's notice, when does it get interrupted, that broadcast? Adele, poor Chris's wife, the shrew, who can't appreciate his painting, goes down to listen to it, and why does she come back? It's interrupted. If you watch the film again and attend to it, you will notice that one of the strange sounds, the first of many very strange sounds we hear, is the broadcast failing. Mm-hmm. We hear basically a channel that is not broadcasting the signal, and thus we hear the technology as such. Mm-hmm. That's a form of sonic reflexivity.
Absolutely.
It's not the only one, however. When we get to one of the first scenes of Johnny and Kitty in their new apartment, there's a record player playing a record, and at a certain point, the record starts skipping.
Indeed.
And we hear the word love, 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 and Johnny gets annoyed and gets up and says, "Are you so lazy? Get up and fix the malfunction." That's at 20, for those who want to check it, it's about 21 minutes into the film.
Yeah.
Exactly an hour later, at 1 hour and 21 minutes, this is on the Criterion copy that I looked at, that I viewed, Chris enters the apartment suddenly, late at night, after the incredible coup with Higgins,
right.
That has liberated him to finally be able to consummate his marriage with the desired Kitty, enters the apartment where Kitty and Johnny are having a tryst, and we hear the same,
Absolutely.
not only the same song, the same scratch, the same audio technological malfunction, exactly an hour later. So the scratch, which is itself a repetition, is repeated. The repetition of the repetition of the kind of repetition that is a malfunction. And what is the word that we hear? Love, love, love. And that then migrates, so I would suggest, into this unbelievable sound design of his mania, right? Where suddenly he cannot help but hear the repetition of the words that have seared into his soul, the fact that she doesn't love him but loves Johnny. Why do we not attend to it more? Because it's an amazingly beautiful and complex and Baroque form of sound design, which I think you're absolutely right, is something that points back to the early moments in Lang's sound career.
Absolutely.
M being most paradigmatic. It's because that moment, that complex audio, and I urge those of you who want to rewatch the film, listen to it with headphones. You get the full spatial complexity of this audio design. It is psychologized. As we have been taught to do by a Hollywood narration, we understand it as his internal psychosis, not incorrectly. But by doing so, we don't attend to the foregroundedness of its technological composition. It's a form of construction. Now, what else is a form of construction that erases itself when it is successful? Perspectival rendering.
Oh, so now we are getting the visual related to the oral.
Exactly. In other words, there's a kind of interesting debate that's thematized in the film about forms of representation that don't, in a certain sense, that erase the artisanal dimension. So the portrait of Higgins that
Right.
sits in his living room, reminding him of the man his wife used to be married, the dead Higgins, who is not dead, it turns out. When his friend comments on it, he says, "That's not painting, that's mud. It's photography," right? It is a form of technological iteration. It's simply representation. What is the comment that's made and rehearsed again about Chris's paintings? They lack perspective. Perspective understood as that form of three-dimensional representation that erases its own conditions of inscription by being a window onto the world.
Yep.
We see what's there, we see the represented, and it erases the inscription, the traces of the representation itself, right? So that foregroundedness, which is what in fact makes those paintings interesting.
Yeah, absolutely.
And by the way, in an astonishing, I usually avoid these kinds of historical details, but this one's so delicious. The man, John Bennett, who made those 12 paintings for the film, they were exhibited at MoMA the year after the film was released.
Yep.
Isn't that hilarious? I mean, given that at one point Johnny's idea was, I'm going to bring these, to a museum and get them to acknowledge their importance and thus their value. So, to come back to the question of the acoustic, if in a certain sense the film's thematic focus on the paintings has already alerted us to the fact that it is precisely paintings without perspective
Right.
that are doing something. It's similarly precisely the refusal of a simple intelligibility which is what a lack of
Right.
perspectival representation involves, that is also, I think, true of the soundtrack. But we have to know how to listen to it. To listen to it in all of its uncanniness.
Right, okay.
Because that last scene, which you mentioned, this deeply undecidable scene when there's a scene on the busy holiday Fifth Avenue, 57th Street, sorry, holiday season, and he sees the portrait that he painted of his love, which has now been rechristened as a self-portrait of her by herself. Raising the question of signature, which we'll get to.
Yeah, we will.
But then, in an act that should cue us very foregroundedly, because it's something that Lang doesn't do, and certainly doesn't do much in this film, if at all, suddenly the crowd disappears.
Mm-hmm.
In a dissolve, suddenly he's alone, right? Which is to say, it breaks a certain rule of a certain kind of narrative cinema in favor of a kind of foregrounded device. Right? There's no question of realism here. We're somewhere else. He's now, the crowd has evaporated, and he's now alone.
With the image.
And with the sound. Because there, the last thing we hear is Johnny, Johnny, this uncanny, I'm getting goosebumps just hearing myself, because it's the sound, which is to say the foregrounded device of sound design as a technique to raise the question of what is agency? Because the other important thing that the sound, I think, points to is a question that the film raises thematically on all kinds of levels, which is, what does it mean to have agency? What is authorship, right? Foregroundedly, Chris doesn't sign his paintings. In so doing, he opens up the possibility that someone else can sign them. And if indeed, what does it mean for someone to sign something? What does it mean for that to be a work of an author? The paintings exhibit a kind of style. He describes it as the style of a kind of amorous expressionism. Yes. Right? It's a love story. He tells Kitty a articulate aesthetic credo that she then, in one of the many instances of iteration in the film, rehearses for the art critic.
I want to come back to this question of perspective because perspective circulates in the film as a question beyond the question of just what is perspective in painting. The engine of the plot itself comes out of false perspective on the assumption if you bump into a brave gentleman in a particular neighborhood at Greenwich Village dressed in tuxedo who says he's a painter, then he must be wealthy and he must be a famous painter. So there's there's all kinds of ways in which characters are taking particular perspectives upon false assumptions, but then those false assumptions lead to actions in all kinds of ways.
Yes.
You know, and the signature, once she's signature, then everybody frames it with all these, what you and I scholars call paratextual stuff about, oh yes, she's the artist who will not speak about her work, as opposed to being the artist who can't speak about her work because she knows nothing about her work, because it's not that. Then there's an entire mythology of interpretation of her work that comes out of the fact that now it has her signature, and therefore you can build an image of her as the author, of her as the artist, you know, around it. Just as she is falsely, you know, built the image of Chris as he has to be famous and he has to be wealthy.
If I could recast what you describe as perspective as conditions of legibility.
I'll buy that.
No, which is what perspective is, right?
Right,
It's
exactly.
it's a condition of legibility. Then the question is, what are the things that allow us to read a work in a certain way? One is a signature, but another is other types of discourse, for example, art criticism.
Exactly.
Or another kind of framing, which is the art gallery, right?
Absolutely.
Galleries produce legibility. Criticism produces legibility.
Correct.
And in each case, they produce a mythology of the female artist, of the unknown artist, of the hidden genius discovered by the critic. And yet, even these works, lacking perspective, then become instrumentalized. As we see when the portrait leaves at the end, and the gallerist says, "Oh, it's her masterpiece. I'm sorry to see it go." And the rich client says, "I don't think you're probably that bummed out since I paid you $10,000
That's
for
exactly
it."
right.
Which is to say, even those works that seem to violate a certain norm, which seem to have a kind of aesthetic value, when reinserted into the art market, and this film is a magnificent description and portrait of the economy of the art market, even these can then be subjected to the same instrumentalization.
Right, absolutely, and become a commodity within the market, not art unto itself in that Kantian kind of way.
Right,
and that's to summarize some of the things we've been saying. There is a extraordinary level of reflexivity in this film.
Yes.
About the technologies that are being used to make the film, but the technologies being portrayed in the film, but also into the whole process of what constitutes the issue of art in our society itself. Now, that which is the subject here is painting, but you know, you don't have to be that far away to say, well, wait a minute, movies are also go out and are marketed, etc. So it all comes back around to this. And so while we do not have somebody who is explicitly a filmmaker or in the manner of later things like Rear Window or Blow Up, which because they have photographers, as protagonists, okay, that. Nonetheless, this picture should be seen in that context of the kinds of works that are as much about the medium in which they're being created, or how media creates meaning, as it is about the plot and the story. And I'm going to be conspicuous that this is a film much admired for its performances. They are much, much discussed. And that's a great thing, and I admire all of it, but I'm happy we're actually not talking about them in our limited amount of time, because there's a richness to this film that should be appreciated in the wholeness of that,
Right.
That you don't get to until you get to these other aspects.
I think putting this film in the context of Rear Window and Blow Up is in brilliant insight, because it's not obvious, because both of those other films foregroundedly explore a medium, a technological medium. Rear Window, binoculars and scopophilia,
Yeah.
technologized scopophilia. Photography, paradigmatically, he's a photographer.
Yeah.
He has his telephoto lens.
Yeah.
And Blow Up, audio.
Yeah.
Right? Sorry, Blow Out.
Blow out is audio.
And
Blow up,
also the photography.
Well, but blow
Right.
out and the conversation
Right.
are the
Would be
two
the analogy,
films.
yes.
The two films that foreground
Exactly.
precisely the audio technologies. So there's a way in which this is a film that, if you want to make it prophetic in some, playing with the word prophetic, it has these concerns that are so clearly foregrounded in Rear Window and Blow Up, and the
Thematically so, yes.
yes, and the conversation and Blow Out.
Yes, absolutely. And yet, why is this film not one that everybody talks about in terms of its, exploration of sound and sound technologies, and the question of iteration? I want to talk about more about iteration in a moment. It's because, in a certain sense, the film slips it in.
Well, good point. Now,
And only when
sly film.
Yes, it's a beautiful, and there you see Lang's magisterial command of the complex multisensorial dimension of cinema, which is he's able to do. If you go back and listen to the scene when Chris is in his depressing room with a flashing neon sign out the window, and it's the first time that this incredible sonic.
I'm going to have to cut you. I'm going to cut you off, and I'm going to cut you off because they have to go back and look at that again.
They do,
and because we've run out of time.
Oh no!
Oh no! Oh no! Oh no! If you've liked our discussion here today, I hope you're going to join us in coming weeks on City Cinematheque for discussions of other films. If you'd like to know all about that, you need to visit our website. Please visit www.tv.cuny.edu. There you'll find all the information that you'll need. Sorry to cut you off, Tom, but there's a lot more to be said, and I hope people at home continue talking and thinking about this marvelous and rich work. Thanks again for being back on
Thanks,
City
Jerry.
Cinema.
A pleasure.
Okay. And thank you for joining us here again today as we continue our stroll through the archives of film history. Bye-bye for now.